Hello one and all, and welcome to Vision Denial, the World Watch 2022. My name is Sam, and for those who are new here, I watch all of the playoff series from all 11 participating regions. Yes, that includes that one. From here on, you're going to be seeing a bunch of videos of what I'd put up on TikTok. That'll be just across the videos that happened, or across the playoffs that I watch over the week, which include all of the ones from August 28th, starting with the second one from there. So that's the finals of GEN.G versus T1, up until September 2nd's LJL semifinals, Sengoku Gaming versus Fukuoka SoftBank Hawks Gaming. If you ever want to see all of these releases as I finish them, the link in the description will go to the TikTok. We've got a lot of interesting series, a lot of disappointing ones, a lot of really surprising ones, but overall the sensation that because a lot of these are lower bracket series, that this was expected to be around the lower quality end of some of the plays. It was expected, just slightly so. But there's still some very interesting stuff to go over and to really capture and experience from this, and we're going to be seeing a bit of a trend over time. So without further ado, let's take a look at the first series that we watched over the week. It's the grand finals of the LCK. We've got GEN.G versus T1. Honestly, this is probably the longest and most recognizable rivalry in League of Legends, period. I can't, and for it to come ahead over here in such a one-sided stomp, what an absolute masterclass from GEN.G, who outplayed T1 and confirmed being the first seed for the LCK. The previous series was, matching chaos with just better chaos against Liiv Sandbox. This series is about matching control with even better control. Both teams have excellent vision play, map movement, side lane control, draft sense, and so on and so on. But GEN.G show up just a little better. Not just in laning matchups, but in team fightings, execution of win conditions, zone play, so on, all of the big buzzwords. Any little thing that T1 can do, GEN.G can do better. And not from a lack of trying by T1. While T1 may have been a little bit more proactive, GEN.G spent a lot of time finding ways to force mistakes out of T1 or create winning trades around the map when they are forced to answer T1's plays. T1 never got a chance to play their crazy tactical approaches consistently, because GEN.G met them at their best. I think from this, GEN.G is for sure one of the contenders for the world titles, especially in this form. And while maybe not the favorite, I want to see what the other teams look like at their finals and qualifications, but they look to be semi-finalists for sure. I honestly want to shout out the whole team from GEN.G for being so incredibly good, but my behavior has been mostly to shout out just two members. So I'll give it to Peanut and Lehens, who honestly were just instrumental in keeping T1 at bay and zoned out. So excited to see both these teams at Worlds. God, it's going to be so good. Let's take a look at the next one. Off to Japan for the technically winners finals. Any of these winners would have gone straight to the finals. We've got, in the LGLs, Detonation Focus Me versus Sengoku Gaming. And it's left me with not so great ambitions for the region. While I don't think the vision or neutral play is good from either team, Detonation Focus Me gained the benefit of being a more proactive team of the two, which lands better in this particular meta. Sengoku Gaming in their leads would just slowly siege, place sparse vision, and reset, while Detonation Focus Me would regularly try to find avenues back into the game, or at least how to close it out. Sengoku Gaming is another one of those teams that on paper play better, but in practice wind up just waiting for opponents to make mistakes instead of forcing them or creating plays. This is a little unfortunate given how solid their drafts are in general. Their vision play is stronger generally, and they do have great wave management and coordination. But the team is slower, so it doesn't matter that the vision control of Detonation Focus Me doesn't match their vision denial, which their vision denial is excellent. I just don't know why they don't how do I say, add vision to it? Or that they coin flip or use neutrals as a fight starter, very rushed. Or that their target selection isn't even all that great or consistent. They're usually first to the play, and given what I've seen out of the rest of the LJL, this doesn't look great for them, as most of the other teams don't tend to be as proactive as what Detonation Focus Me is showing. And it's likely that we're going to see them represent Japan again this year, as far as we can tell. We'll see how the other games go, right? So, shout out to Steel and Yaharong, who played out of their minds to work within the fringes of any team fight, especially in Game 3. Holy smoke, Yaharong. Your Zoe? No one should let him get a Zoe again. Take a look at the next series. And we're off to Southeast Asia's PCS. In the lower bracket quarterfinals, we got Paris Saint-Germain Talons versus J-Team, and dear Lord, these two teams usually deliver something, and today they delivered, honestly, I wouldn't expect either of these teams to make it to Worlds. To me, they're just out of the running completely, right? Because if this is what you get, it's rather unfortunate. Because we get glimpses from both teams of what it looks like when they're proactive and take risks. The Talons don't know their limits, and J-Team are solid, but don't know how to establish pressure outside of when they've made the proactive move. Outside of that, the Talons show a stronger aptitude around neutral objectives and side lane control, but neither team show good vision play compared to the standards of the international teams who have qualified, or even of the teams in their own region. There's an unfortunate nature to watching two teams figure out what angles of approach for their fights and then never actually executing on it. The Talons, when not being proactive, at least make the time to set up the play and establish control around the map and apply pressure. J-Team, not being proactive, just watches the map burns around them. And that's what made the difference in this game. Didn't matter that J-Team finally woke up at the tail end of Game 3. The damage had been done around the map, and for the Talons' win conditions, just it making the whole thing, no matter how large or any advantage that you would get, an uphill battle, as the Talons only needed one fight to secure the whole thing. Shout out to Burry and Gory, who during the early games established so much of the setup that got the Talons ahead. Let's take a look at the next series. And we're into the VCS with the lower bracket elimination for round 1. We've got, and this is from Vietnam VCS, we've got over here Team Secret versus SBTC Esports. I'll be calling them the Roosters. This was an interesting series. Now, I think that the Roosters struggled to come up with a variety of plays that help them, how to approach most of their fundamentals. They hold some solid neutral setup, some excellent vision play, and instead of working around all of that, they either handshake trades around the map where they could win those trades instead of just handshaking them, or create a repetitive play over and over again that worked at the start of the game for sure and worked for a little bit, but as it keeps getting executed, is done worse and worse over time. As like Team Secret just really gets to, get used to their approach to it. I wish they were doing something else most of the time. The Roosters show that when ahead they can keep control, but that their proactivity is severely limited, and they rely on Secret to make mistakes for the most part. Secret, for their part, are rather sloppy in terms of their early game and in terms of their vision. But, they have solid coordination and teamfight presence and a good sense on how to approach neutral objectives and stronger draft sense overall. Good idea of how to approach their win conditions and all of that. The only thing is that they regularly throw themselves at the bus, so to speak, where any play at any given time or aggressive posturing leads them to either throw their lead or relinquish control of the map. And most of the time, they end up course correcting during the games itself, but it's enough to notice a trend that stronger teams will abuse to force errors out of Secret, who seem more than willing to throw themselves for the pace of the game, which is awesome, but positioning matters in this situation. Shout out to Hero02 and Eddie, who absorbed a lot of pressure and managed to get a lot done during the team fights. Take a look at the next series. Off to the TCL for the final semifinals of Turkey's region. We've got the Istanbul Wildcats versus SuperMassive Blaze. And, oh boy, this was so one-sided. And, in a very bizarre way. Anywho, okay. SuperMassive couldn't compete with the level of coordination and side lane control that the Wildcats brought. The Wildcats knew their limits, how to approach their win conditions, how to establish the vision that they needed for any given play. The largest issue is just how ambitious they are at trying to pull off some of these plays, as they kind of fumble and stumble over their steps occasionally. Now, SuperMassive, for their part, still remained as proactive as possible, but keeping up with the pace that the Wildcats had going was very challenging for them. Even in moments where it seemed like SuperMassive had full tempo control, the Wildcats were still making plays around the map to split them up or to answer equal or ahead. Now, there's a clear conscious approach to how the Wildcats want to win the game, and that's through proper dominance of the early game and carrying the momentum from there. Seems simple. That said, I do want to see how the Wildcats would fare against a team who is more consistent at closing out games. SuperMassive did their best, but would wound up resetting way more often than necessary, especially in Game 2, where their game state could have warranted pressing the issue a little bit more. Given what I've seen so far, it wouldn't surprise me if the Wildcats did win the world slots in the finals in a similar fashion as they did this series. But who knows? Fenerbahce has been surprising many. Shout out to Sadin and Starscreen, who controlled the team fights in ways that really allowed Holy Phoenix to free fire so much damage. Holy moly. Let's take a look at the next series. It's time for the lower bracket playoff. From Europe's LEC, we've got Fnatic, the Giants, and XL newcomers. And this is our second reverse sweep. And the LEC often produces some of my favorite series during playoffs. And this is for sure one of them. It's such a shame that the format is what it is, because I would have preferred to have both of these teams move on to Worlds, given the kind of play that we saw from them. For XL, the early game coordination, pressure, tempo, and vision was unparalleled. Now, that isn't to say that Fnatic were slouches, by no means. This just was a solid set of games from both sides. But as the series goes on, Fnatic managed the second reverse sweep of the summer and showed that XL only really excelled in the early to mid game and struggled to show consistent success in the late game, whether it was from map movement, neutral setup, or team fighting. Which, by the way, so good from both sides. There's a lot of really interesting angles that go off in the first 4 games. And it's really a large shame that like the time that went into the series, the 5th game, both teams looked spent and were inconsistent. Anyways, Fnatic, for their part, require a lot of momentum in-game and series to get going, which concerns me. Like, I'm really concerned by their approach of the early game and how much they were willing to just forego a lot of like neutral objectives to avoid fights that could get worse for them. That said, their vision play and late game decision coordination was excellent, and I think a large contributor to the reverse sweep itself, outside of like the fatigue. The duos from both teams deserve a shout out, but in all honesty, just because of the format, shout out to Upset and Razark, who really maximize the efficacy of the drafts in every way imaginable. Take a look at the next series. And we're off to Brazil's CBLOL semifinals. We've got Loud versus Furia. This is just so one-sided. Now, I've mentioned it before. All right, series like these are hard to evaluate, given how much we have to just assume if it's either one team really not performing to the level needed, or the other team is just overperforming. In this case, I'm just going to say it. Furia was underperforming. We've seen what a team like them can do to compete. Heck, they did so well against Pain and against every other team in the lower bracket. But the poor draft choices, inability to play towards their win conditions, bizarre positioning and map movement, and the priorities just being all over the place doesn't cut it. Which is a shame because their coordination and vision play were things this team had fairly solid. Now, the second I saw the Quinn top in Game 3, I just had a feeling that the whole thing was doomed. Now, Loud for their side of things, we'll have a chance at the rematch against Pain Gaming. And while I don't think the result will change, this boost of confidence and momentum, might help. It was really unfortunate, but some positives. I really liked how well Loud ballooned the leads. I think they just get a little overzealous, and any team that can catch that will usually punish it and minimize as much as what has been ballooned previously. I think I'm just a little bothered because in this series, it just seemed as if neither team were super proactive, as much as like one was just generally less proactive than the other, spending their time to set up for things, and then when one team missteps, there you go. Hopefully, Loud can fix some of their hiccups if they want to qualify for Worlds. Shout out to Brance and Seos, who really outplayed the Furia duo at every moment. Let's take a look at the next series. And we get to the second semifinals of the winners bracket, or the upper bracket of North America's LCS. We've got Cloud9 versus Evil Geniuses. And congrats on Cloud9 being the 10th team to qualify for Worlds. Now, Evil Geniuses hold a lot of solid fundamentals. Good wave manipulation, side lane controls, decent vision play, some solid coordination, questionable decision making here or there. But the main issue lies in where they choose to be proactive. Their drafts primarily focus on small skirmish and wave manipulations, making neutral fights harder to engage on. Cloud9, for their part, have solid draft sense and neutral play that complements this current meta, And as they were much more proactive in this series, it's no wonder that Evil Geniuses found themselves regularly on the back foot. Now, much more proactive doesn't mean proactive enough. Cloud9 looked more prepared to make active moves mid to late game, as Evil Geniuses held a lot of ground early game, and preference for when the proactivity would happen on either team didn't matter when Cloud9 were doing more to get their win conditions unlocked and ready to go. I do think that it's notable that Cloud9, despite their proactivity issues, still had enough going for them to deal with this particular matchup. Evil Geniuses going into the lower bracket and seeing the other three teams there in TSM, Counterlogic Gaming, and Team Liquid, I'm really unsure who comes out on top as the third and last seed of the LCS for the Worlds. But I'm not confident it'll be Evil Genius, given how much more proactive the other three teams are and how they prioritize to get their leads. It really will depend on if Evil Geniuses pivots and adapts towards this current meta properly. Shout out to Jensen and Berserker, who were huge in each skirmish and fight. All eyes were on them. Let's take a look at the next series. All right, we head off to the semifinals of the losers bracket, round 2 of the losers bracket, where we got Fukuoka SoftBank Hawks Gaming versus Rascal Jesters in the LJL from Japan. If both teams had played like they did in Game 4, but for the entire series, I would have a very different impression of both of them. In matters of vision, team fighting, neutral setups, and even draft sense, both teams exhibited some form of either shyness or hesitation to the approach. And in some cases, just inability to perform the drafts their compositions that they draft. And while I do acknowledge that these issues do disappear by the time Game 4 rolls around, it looked like the winner of the series was going to be the team that got their shit together first, which so happened to be the Hawks. Now, to their credit, the Hawks do know what their win conditions are and how to close out games once they are there, but whether they know how to get to their win conditions is rather inconsistent. The Jesters, for their part, seemed to be on the ball faster when it came to the drafts, but not as much on executing them either. I also appreciate that both teams, even if sloppily, did put active attention to the side lane pressure while trying to make moves around the map. But the lack of consistent application to their drafts, the very poor positioning, and overall bizarre decisions on occasions means that the team who is just slightly faster to the draw comes out the victor, which in this case just so happens to be the Hawks. And from this, it doesn't give me any confidence that either of these teams would even do well against Sengoku Gaming. Shout out to Dasher for his fancy footwork, and Marvel, who kept up damage as much as possible in the chaos of a lot of these fights. Take a look at the next series. And we're off to Vietnam in the VCS's upper bracket semifinals. We've got Saigon Buffaloes versus GAM Esports, also known as the Marines. And congratulations to the Buffaloes on being the 11th team to qualify for Worlds. And I would not be surprised if GAM were to follow right after. Both teams have styles that complement each other to make an interesting series. While both have excellent vision, GAM is a little bit more defensive, while the Buffaloes are more river-focused. They both have opportunities to show that they play with aggressive vision, but that tends to be their, go-to. Both are proactive, but the Buffaloes focus on neutral control, while GAM focus on wave manipulations and flanking. This leads to moments where one team would make a proactive move for just the other to contest or answer elsewhere, and then they switch positions where the other one is proactive, and then the other has to contest. It was very nice, and the pace of these games never stopped, rarely ever being in the hand of one or the other for very long. I think that the Buffaloes drafted more consistent to their style, while GAM had a lot more flexibility within their drafts, but not always really leaning into their play style overall. And looking at this particular series, and I'm comparing Team Secret, who was just waiting in the lower bracket, they wouldn't even fare properly against GAM or the Marines, who would be just, it would just be hard. Because of the two of the series, GAM is the more aggressive and consistently proactive, sometimes to their detriment when uncoordinated. I would always give them the edge. And, like, it's just really unfortunate. Now, and despite their loss for GAM, it mostly played onto the backs of who had the better execution when they held control. And the Buffaloes won out and were a lot more consistent with giving that part. Still, I'm of the impression that the Marines will join the Buffaloes as the second rep for the VCS at Worlds. It's just a matter of formality. Shout out to BeanJ and Shogun, who during laning phase and team fights really maximized any and every lead the Buffaloes could get. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the grand finals of China's LPL with JD Gaming versus Top Esports. Let me readjust. Oh, much better. And as per usual, this series was close and won by the margin of errors at times. Now, Top Esports showing some excellent approaches to neutral objectives and vision control, while JD Gaming do everything to maneuver the map and gain any small advantages and trades that move, that are trade ups. Now, just in classic LPL sense, nothing is either left uncontested or unanswered somewhere else on the map. Both teams also fall prey to the win early, and everything becomes even and close late game scenario. A little too often, as that is something that's happened 10 for 10 games now between these two teams. Either team becoming first seed for the LPL here would have been justified given how close the series, or both of these series, were. And I'm afraid a little bit that both teams managed to garner a lot of leads early to mid-game, and then it starts to really just fall apart, and that a lot of stronger international teams will take advantage of that in some way. It's a shame, really, because both teams do find creative angles of attack to gain their leads, but often fumble either due to a bad macro trade or a fight is created from a positional error on the international stage that might not fly as well. But from this, I can also see both of these teams making the semifinals because of how they're proactive and really push the envelope on any given particular situation. So rather playing behind or ahead, they're not going to let go any contest. Honestly, I'm pretty sure that Top Esports could have won this final game if it wasn't for the last fight where Liiv was caught out of position in their base. Oh well. Shout out to Hope and Yagao, who managed to create so much space and damage, even while having, for a lot of the games, almost zero additional resources added to their play. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the regional qualifiers, and I still count that as a playoff game. So here we go. We got the LCKs, Damwon Kia versus Liiv Sandbox. And congratulations on Damwon Kia on being the 12th team to qualify for Worlds. Now, what happens when you never let Liiv Sandbox fight on their terms? Well, it's what Damwon Kia did to succeed against Liiv Sandbox. It was super simple. You just played the side lanes better. Liiv Sandbox have a hyper focus on team fighting, and when they don't have the tools at the right time, they falter, either from poor flank setups or poor lack of awareness of flanks, the level differences, or the straight up gold difference that would exist. And that really comes as Dove being the weak link in this setup. Having Nuguri be the stronger of the two laners made a huge impact on how Liiv Sandbox were able to perform. Because outside of that, Liiv Sandbox have solid drafts, and both teams play vision just as well as the other, and they both have similar proactive plays and poor judgment calls as to when they need to fight. Damwon and Kia, for their part, recognized the weakness in Liiv Sandbox, and yet still found it incredibly hard to just play out the late game and close out huge decisive leads. A weakness that, for years now, this was so well documented, will be just equally heavily punished as we head into Worlds. Is like, no team is going to let them get away with mindlessly playing out the late game, lost and confused. I can't find a way how you would garner such a huge lead with no Flame Horizon and then some, and not be able to close out games with like an 8 to 10k gold lead. Now, otherwise, a lot of the weaker teams at Worlds are not going to know how to deal with the early game snowball that Damwon is accustomed to, which is just par for the course. Now, shout out to Showmaker, who created a lot of space in these fights, and to Nuguri, who, again, was the difference maker in this series. Let's take a look at the next one. It's the Southeast Asians PCS's Winners Finals with CTBC Flying Oysters versus Megabank Beyond Gaming in the Battle of the Banks. And congratulations to the Flying Oysters on being the 13th team to qualify for Worlds. This was a bizarre series to say the least. Beyond Gaming, for their part, are consistent in their team fighting, vision play, and drafts, but when it comes to macro movements and side lane advantages, or even team fighting, they lose out to the Flying Oysters. And not from a lack of trying either. For a moment, it would look like a back and forth series, especially within the first two games, but Game 3 rolls around. And it shows that once Beyond Gaming fall behind, they find it harder and harder to come back, regardless of how proactive they are. The Flying Oysters, on the other hand, are also bizarre. A little inconsistent with vision, but excellent around neutral objectives and side lane play, which really necessitates solid vision work. And best of all, however, their coordination around team fighting is solid, but not necessarily around map movement and trying to make any particular plays. They also know exactly how to play while ahead, properly ballooning leads and applying pressures in ways that make it incredibly hard to approach them, harder than usual even. The decision making when behind, however, is another story. To extra emphasize their lack of coordination on macro movement, while behind it becomes a compounding issue. Sometimes I did notice the Flying Oysters, when trying to close, are excellent, but slow. Almost as if a little reserved and hesitant to close it out until certain, which is not to be confused with some teams who don't know how to close altogether. Beyond Gaming have another chance to qualify for Worlds, but I'm not super confident they'll make it. Uncertain. Shout out to Mission and Rest, who have been excellent at setting up the team for success during these team fights. Let's take a look at the next series. And we're into the semifinal losers of the North American LCS. We've got Team Liquid versus Counterlogic Gaming. To be a CLG fan is never a good time. Now, as a CLG fan, there is nothing more poetic than getting your hopes up and then being disappointed completely. Now, that said, the series was super interesting on how both teams play out their series respectively. Because on paper, both have solid vision and early game application, really excellent at playing out leads, while struggling a little bit to answer while behind, solid coordinated team fights while ahead, while being a little disjointed when behind. Both teams excel at early game approach and only work as a team if they are ahead, otherwise most of their games just kind of fall apart. what's really fascinating to me watching this series and watching all of the other ones these two teams have played is that this isn't a game-to-game aspect, because either team moving on for me would have been fine from a game-to-game aspect. Yes, even with my CLG bias, if Team Liquid lost and CLG went so on the direction, I'm pretty okay with Team Liquid moving on. But as a series as a whole, like, how is it that Counter Logic Gaming are really strong right out the gate, but lose steam as more games pass, and Team Liquid take 1 to 2 games to get going before really finding their stride? Honestly, I prefer CLG's situation, but not by much, as it leads to this being the third reverse sweep of the summer playoffs. Now, as Team Liquid moves on, and I'm looking at Evil Geniuses and Team Solo Mid, and I'm not a big fan of who the prospective third team is for the LCS. Team Liquid look like the strongest contenders, depending on how the other series shows, but they need to show strong play right out the gate in their series, or it doesn't look like they'll be having a good time at Worlds. Now, shout out to Santorin and Bjergsen, who do a lot of work to get the team in a solid position for any of the given team fights. Let's take a look at the next series. It's what I would call the lowest of low brackets for any of these regions. It's the regional qualifier, the first one, where we've got Edward Gaming International versus Royal Never Give Up in our fourth reverse sweep. And congrats to Edward Gaming on being the 14th team to qualify for Worlds. And also to get the chance to defend your title. Now, game 1 and 2, Edward Gaming, whack. Games 3 to 5, Edward Gaming, awesome. Or the Royals were somewhat consistent in terms of macro choices, vision play, side lane controls, and so on, allowing us a purview of consistency across the board. The consistency disappears as we head to the mid to late game stages, as they really fumble neutral objective options. Edward Gaming, for their part, looked incredibly lost and incapable of proving why they were top 3 in the upper playoff brackets. Then game 3 rolls around, and the awful vision play becomes darn near perfect. The map movement that was questionable becomes more consistent and cohesive. The team fighting, my God, is it ever so nice to see a team use vision and map movement to gain advantages even while behind. And that's just the thing. They didn't become perfect. From game 3, they still had the same kinds of issues where some priorities made no sense from Edward Gaming, but they became more recognizable as the same team that made it to the double elimination portion of the playoffs. And terrifying still. And awesomely, they were always looking for an avenue on how to regain leads and push the leads that they had harder. And the other tier 1 and 2 teams from any other international region should be worried, because this is now the tier 3 seed for the LPL. The Royals, with this kind of form, look okay, but given the performance that LNG showed, I'm starting to think that the MSI champs are not gonna go to Worlds. Shout out to JJ and Scout, who really created so much space for every team fight angle to work. Let's take a look at the next series. We're in the LCK's lowest of the low regional finals brackets with DRX versus KT Rolsters, and I don't know what to tell you about this series. Honestly, KT had a lot going for them. Incredible early game, fantastic vision and neutral play, solid coordination while ahead. What they don't have, right, is consistent late game macro choices or even consistent drafts. The drafts especially feel insulting in some sense. The worst part is KT is a cut above DRX roll for roll and should have won the first game and gotten a 3-0. Or at least that was the expectation. And I think that that expectation got to their heads as late game approaches and they become lazy or uncoordinated, or as the drafts further into the series become erratic, allowing just DRX easier to execute compositions. Overall, allowing DRX to play a style in which they can come out on top is just kind of unacceptable, really, because their style is like DRX have good vision occasionally and poor vision regularly, inconsistent neutral setups and side lane control, and awkward positioning for any skirmishes. But they at least adapted and found so many chances to succeed in this series. But it's one of those things where you don't force mistakes, you just let mistakes happen and then you win. Watching this, I'm convinced that neither of these teams would have won against Liiv Sandbox. And if the previous series of DRX versus Liiv Sandbox had any indication of what's to come next, I don't think the rematch will have a different result. Shout out to Juhan, who subbed in and did a whole lot more than Piosik could, and Kingen, who was the most consistent member of the team. Let's take a look at the next series. And it's the semifinals of the Japanese LJLs with Sengoku Gaming versus Fukuoka SoftBank Hawks Gaming. It was interesting. It's really weird to watch a series where one team spends a lot of time practicing regimented plays and map movement, and the other lives by pure chaos and skill checks. Now, the Hawks show fantastic vision and neutral play, solid side lane controls, and otherwise excellent draft sense. The issue here lies in the mid to late game stages of the game, where it is clear that they are rushing through plays without properly accounting for the tools that are available for both sides, leaving them in rather tricky spots. Or even in the early game, when they make very elaborate level 1 plays, or even answers to the other play, and with minimal gain to speak of. Blank really spent a lot of time investing in trying to disrupt anything that would be coming out of coming from his opponent, and it just left it with like mostly nothing. It's a lot of dissatisfaction, which was super interesting just to see how Once would just react. But honestly, I don't think it was worth the pain. That said, they sure leveled up from the last series. The thing here, though, is that Sengoku Gaming contested and checked for any mistakes that the Hawks, leading them to lose. Sengoku Gaming, for their part, mostly played reactive. They have strong early game and laning phases, really leaning into the win lane, win game sentiment, but otherwise it is fairly autopilot and skill checks from there. This doesn't help when a team has fairly inconsistent vision, unless ahead, and takes very little time to set up any of their plays. A team like this, proactive, I could see making worlds and making moves, but the lack of proactivity makes it hard for me to see where this team could go. Shout out to Once, who really established early game control, and Jet, who played out of his mind to zone control the Hawks in chaotic ways. Take a look at the next series. Well, yeah, that was super interesting over the course of that particular set of playoffs. Across this particular week, we've talked a lot in the last previous videos about the state of neutral objectives and how to properly focus them, or like how teams particularly go for them. The state of like the priority on certain picks, the aims that some teams or some regions around the world really put focus over others. And as a lot of the teams start to qualify, and so far from what I've watched, there's up to 14 teams that have qualified now. The sensation that I'm getting from this is that as much as there's a huge underlying focus on how the bot lane is drafted, the bot lane means almost nothing across all of it. And teams who tend to be more flexible and stray away from the same typical bot lane meta already have a larger breadth of availability when it comes to like flexibility, so on and so forth. Now, whether or not that has strictly to do with it being the best move, like by all accounts and purposes for late game scaling team fights, especially if you are not going to be crushing it early game, your Lulus, Sivers, Zeris, Yumis are going to be the interchangeable for this situation. Totally understandable. But with the rise of Poppy, the rise of Sejuani, the really contentious usage of Renekton and Aatrox, it becomes very clear that, like, honestly, the top half of the map being ahead matters a lot more to allow the scaling of the bot lane to work. And if the answers don't work in that way, then you really need to play off of, like, again, the secondary motions are like your Kalista and whatever engaged tank, as well as your Lucian Nami type situation. Now, this seems boring on across a lot of fronts, but as far as the patches go, that'll definitely change. And I'm more interested in teams who opt out, so to speak, like the ones who regularly pick Aphelios, Jinx, Neela. I'm super interested into the direction in which teams will adapt going to Worlds. Because that's the main focus for me, is that with so many same compositions over and over again, the repeated uses of the Wukong, despite the fact that there's clearly a huge abundance of other junglers that work as a contest for it, or like how much Aatrox and Renekton are being used, despite the fact that, like, clearly Ornn provides the most amount of, like, utility. This just, I'm more interested about how do teams really prioritize focusing on either purely early game, purely scaling, or overall utility for the mid game, where neutral objectives are the most important. I rambled for a little bit, and just, I guess to, like, really bring up the point, the flexibility of drafts is really key and important because the parts of the game really indicate or really indicated of your draft what your priorities are going to be. And if your priorities aren't neutral objectives or side lane controls, a lot of the drafts themselves don't really feed into those win conditions. They really feed into passivity. It's a really counterintuitive situation where, like, teams are drafting for scaling and passive play whilst still needing to be proactive in hitting early game points and neutral objectives as much as possible to get the game going. And if they fail, they have this, they can stay safely in check, right? But, like, teams who pick Lucian Nami, who, like, regularly proactively try to fight for the Drakes themselves, or teams who pick front to back scaling team fighting actively play to do that. And I'm just wondering when it's going to come to a head, or if that same kind of behavior for drafting is going to lead to Worlds. And if it does, then it's mostly going to be the team that just, like, is the most flexible or the most wild and chaotic that's going to make the biggest waves. Yeah. At least that's what I noticed. I also noticed that, like, some teams just straight up don't know the win conditions or are still fairly inactive overall. Like, the number of teams that get away with just being, let's wait for the opponent to just kind of, like, make mistakes and then we'll just skill check them, is too high. You can't get away with that, especially not on the world stage. And, like, so far, gladly, out of the 14 teams that I've seen qualify, because I know that there are 21 teams that are qualified so far. I'm not caught up yet. Totally fine. But out of the 14 teams that I've seen qualify, none of them are just wait until a mistake happens. A lot of them are proactive. So I'm doubtful that these teams are going to, like, bring in bad drafting sense. But in the back of my mind, I'm like, are we going to get a really shitty meta for Worlds? Really hope that's not the case. those are my thoughts, at least. You guys let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you all those who watch. Super appreciated. I want to hear your thoughts about the situation, about like how you think the current meta is going to affect the ones after, especially after patches come in. Do you think that the drafting decisions now are going to be like brought over going to Worlds? Any and everything in your comments down below. Also, some of your favorite series so far, especially we're in the tail end. I know that Turkey, North America, and Europe are all finishing technically this weekend. I'm not caught up there. That's totally fine. But let me know what your favorite series have been so far. Anything and everything down below. Really appreciate it. And if you like these videos, leave a like, subscribe, all the didgeridoo, all that good stuff. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys next week. Ciao.